Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about Michael Huemer's The Problem of Political Authority. The subtitle is An Examination of the Right to Coerce and the Duty to Obey, and both of those things are going to become important very shortly. Some quick background info. Huemer is a contemporary philosopher. He is alive, he is writing, he is teaching, and he's a professor at UC Boulder in Colorado. He is known mostly for his argument in favor of anarchism, which we're going to be looking at for today, but also he is known for making some moral arguments in favor of veganism, which you might want to check out if that interests you. So remember the subtitle of the text, An Examination of the Right to Coerce and the Duty to Obey. All right, so here's some opening questions. What gives someone the right to use coercion as a means of attaining goals? Coercion is like force or threats of force. Typically, we don't go around in our daily lives using force or threats to get what we want, but we know sometimes some people or groups of people do that. And the question is that ever okay? And if it is, when and why? What we're going to see today is that Huemer is not a fan of coercion, and he focuses on political coercion. Another related question, at what point does someone have a duty to obey someone else? Right, so at what point is your obligation, I guess, solidified to obey someone else's orders, right? So there's two ends of the pole. There's the right of the person using coercion to use coercion, and then there's the obligation that someone has to obey the person using coercion as a means. And we're all hinting at this third question, which is what makes a government's power legitimate, right? Because we're talking about force, we're talking about obeying, we're talking about law, we're talking about the state. So let's take a look at the beginning here. Huemer says, the social contract theory is the most prominent account of authority in the last 400 years of philosophy and has a good acclaim as any to being America's theory of authority. The theory holds that, at least in some countries, there is a contractual relationship between the government and its citizens. The contract requires the government to provide certain services for the population, notably protection from private criminals and hostile foreign governments. In return, citizens agree to pay their taxes and obey the laws. So there's a key term, social contract theory. We've seen this a couple times now. You saw it when we did the Crito, right? When we looked at Socrates and whether or not he should escape prison. You saw it when we did Locke, right? What counts as consenting to this agreement with the government. And you're going to see more of it today. Remember, the social contract theory is this idea that there exists a contractual relationship between the government and then its citizens. And that contractual relationship, kind of to summarize very briefly here, is that you give up certain freedoms that you would have had absent of government imposition, and in return get some kind of safety or service benefit out of it, right? That's the basic idea, and Huemer is going to examine that more. And in return, again, you agree to pay your taxes and obey laws. In the state of nature, to go back to Locke's words, you wouldn't have those things, right? But when you do agree to accept the government services, you agree to do certain things for them, which is use a portion of your money that goes to them to fund their services, and you have to obey the laws. But Huemer questions that. He says, is there a social contract? At first glance, the theory exhibits an imprudent disregard for reality. No one has ever been presented with a contract describing how the government operates and asked for a signature. Few have ever been in a situation in which a verbal or a written statement of agreement to have a government would have been appropriate, let alone have actually made such a statement. But even if there was an original social contract, how could this contract bind people born much later, who never participated in the original agreement and were never asked for consent? Right? So Huemer is not just accepting it. He's saying, is there a social contract? Right? He says, if you look at it explicitly, right, because the first concept of the social contract is the explicit contract. This would require that there be an actual kind of physical contract that describes exactly what the government's going to do and what you're going to do, and then you sign it. And then there we go. I'm part of this agreement. Even if that was a thing, he doesn't think it was, as we're going to see, but even if it was a thing, how could that contract bind people who weren't born yet? This goes back to a critique we may have had of the laws in the Crito with Socrates. The idea is, even if our ancestors did sign some kind of social contract that granted the government legitimacy, what does it have to do with you? What does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with our parents and grandparents? It doesn't matter, right? The idea is, it seems kind of strange, if not immoral, humor would say, to pass the terms of a contract onto generations that did not consent. So there's questionable nature of the contract already. And that word consent is going to wind up being the big word of the day today. But he says, as I've said, this theory is chiefly of historical interest today. No prominent contemporary theorist endorses the explicit social contract theory. The next version of the social contract theory is designed to avoid these problems, right? So no one actually believes in the explicit social contract theory today. It's kind of this historical fiction, something we study, but this other version of the social contract theory that he's going to get to is designed to avoid the problems he mentioned and is something that people proclaim exists to this day. He says, explicit consent is consent that one indicates by stating, either verbally or in writing, that one consents. By contrast, implicit consent is consent that one indicates through one's conduct without actually stating one's agreement. If citizens have not embraced the social contract explicitly, perhaps they have embraced it implicitly. So this distinction we've already seen in Locke's second treatise. So Locke didn't use the words explicit and implicit. He used the words express and tacit. That's basically what it means, right? When Locke says express consent, he means what humor means when he says explicit consent. And then when Locke says tacit consent, that means what humor means when he says implicit consent. So he's saying implicit consent is a thing, right? It does exist, but we have to determine whether or not what's happening currently with U.S. citizens and the U.S. government truly counts as implicit consent. That's going to be the exercise for today. And what he's going to do now is go through 4 different types of implicit consent that exists. So there is such a thing as implicit consent, but not all ways are equal. So he's going to go through each type and give us an example of each type, so then we can later on determine whether or not the situation with us and the U.S. government corresponds to these types of consent. So in 22, he says, how can one indicate agreement without stating agreement? Well, in some situations, one expresses agreement to a proposal simply by refraining from opposing it. I call this passive consent. Suppose you're in a board meeting where the chairman says, next week's meeting will be moved to Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Any objections? He pauses, and no one says anything. Good, it's agreed, the chairman concludes. In this situation, it is plausible that their failure to express dissent when invited to do so indicates that the board members consent to the change. So here's the first type of consent, right? Passive consent. You can get why the name was given to it, because it's not an active, hey, I consent. It's passive, right? You agree to something merely by refraining from opposing it. And this certainly happens sometimes. And in his example, he says, failure to express dissent when invited to do so indicates that the board members consent to the change made by the boss. But here's another type. He says, in other cases, One commits oneself to accepting certain demands by soliciting or voluntarily accepting benefits to which those demands are known to be attached. I call this consent through acceptance of benefits. For example, suppose you enter a restaurant and order a nice, tasty veggie wrap. After you eat the wrap, the waitress brings the check. "What's this?" you say. "I never said I was going to pay for any of this. If you wanted payment, you should have said so at the start. I'm sorry, but I don't owe you anything." In this case, the restaurant could plausibly argue that by ordering the food, you implicitly indicated agreement with the usual demand connected with the provision of that food, namely, payment of the price mentioned on the menu. Because it is well known in this society, and presumably known to you, that restaurants are generally only willing to provide food in order to get paid, it was your responsibility, if you wanted free food, to state this up front. Otherwise, the default assumption is that you agree to participate in the normal practice. For that reason, you would be obligated to pay for your meal, notwithstanding your protestations to the contrary. So the idea is sometimes you receive benefits, but the benefits have some caveats to them. And one of the caveats might be that you have to do something in return for getting the benefits. And so, for example, if you go to a restaurant, yeah, they'll give you food, but they're giving you the food is conditional, right? You have to pay them in return for the food. You don't just get service for nothing. So by accepting the benefits, you consent to the conditions set by the benefits. And it's not like this is coming out of nowhere, right? The idea is like it's basic knowledge that this is the case. No curveballs here. But on 23, he says, a third form of implicit consent is what I call consent through presence, whereby one indicates agreement to a proposal merely by remaining in the same location. While having a party at my house, I announce loudly and clearly to everyone present that anyone who wants to stay at my party must agree to help clean up afterwards. After hearing my announcement, you carry on partying. In doing so, you imply that you agree to help clean up at the end. Okay, so sometimes you consent to something merely by staying in that location, by being present. And the example is, hey, if you're in my house and I say, okay, guys, you can hang out here, but afterwards you have to clean up, and then you look at me, acknowledge that you hear me, and then stay in my house, well, then you're accepting that you have to clean up, right? You're consenting to that merely by your presence. And then here's the fourth way on 23. He says, finally, sometimes one implicitly consents to the rules governing a practice by voluntarily participating in the practice. I call this consent through participation. Suppose that during one of my philosophy classes, I tell the students that I am going to run a voluntary class lottery. Those who want to participate, I explain, will put their names into this hat. I will then draw one name at random. Each of the other participants will then pay $1 to the person whose name is drawn. Suppose that you put your name into my hat. When the winner's name is drawn, you discover, alas, that the winner was not you. I come to collect $1 from you to give to the winning student. And you say, I don't owe you anything. I never said that I agreed to pay $1. All I did was drop my name into your hat. Maybe I was dropping it just because I like putting my name into hats. In this situation, it seems that you are obligated to hand over the dollar. Your voluntary participation in the process, when it was well known how the scheme was supposed to work, implied that you agreed to accept the possible financial burden associated with my lottery scheme. Okay, so sometimes you implicitly consent by doing the thing, right? By participating in the scheme, as he's calling it, right? Participating in this event. So if someone says, like, here are the rules and here's what happens if you participate, well, then you have to follow the rules if you participate, right? In his example, you can't just drop the name into the hat and then not pay your fair share when you lose, because that was part of the conditions of participating. And it's completely voluntary, right? It's not like you're forced to do this thing. You could have not done it. So not only by participating, but by voluntarily participating, you're agreeing to the thing. So to recap, we so far have gone through 4 types of implicit consent. The first one was passive consent. The second one was consent through acceptance of benefits. The third was consent through presence. And the fourth was consent through participation. Here's some questions you might want to consider, because you know where he's going with this, given the context of class, right? Question 1, how might one connect each method of implicit consent to the relationship between the U.S. government and its citizens? Or in other words, second question, how might our current situation in the U.S. count as an implicit social contract? So the idea is that, okay, here are these 4 modes of consenting implicitly to some scheme. The question is, how can we situate these in a political context? How might the actions we take every day without even thinking about it count as one of these forms of consent, not to a restaurant owner, not to a boss, not to someone's house party, but to the government, right? To the people that are in charge. Start thinking about how they might relate. Here's some examples. Well, if you're thinking about passive consent, maybe refraining from actively opposing the government counts as consent. In other words, maybe you do agree to pay taxes and follow laws because you're not going out there actively opposing the government with giving an opportunity. Maybe. Okay, well, what about consent through acceptance of benefits? I think this one's easier because we've had experience with it. What about military and police protection? You are protected by the military if and when something goes wrong. You're clearly accepting a service. Or if the police benefit your community, you're accepting their service. Have you ever called the cops on someone because something got stolen? If you have, then that counts as some kind of benefit that you're accepting. What about public education? I think I asked in class if any of you were homeschooled. I don't think many of you were, which means that the majority, if not all of you, went through the public education system. But the public education system is a government service. You're accepting it. And so now you have to pay the price. Right? This was one of the reasons that the laws gave Socrates in the Crito. They said, you went through years of schooling with us, so clearly you owe us something in return. What about welfare? Do you receive any kind of government aid? Any kind of unemployment? Anything like that? If so, that's a benefit. Well, what about the third type? What about consent through presence? Well, this one goes back to Locke. You're living within the U.S. territory. And as Locke said, if you just set your toes across that geographical line, well, you're consenting to that place's laws, right? If you didn't want to do that, then don't be present within its territory. And the fourth type of consent that you might relate to our situation is voting. Some might think that voting is like the hat example where you drop a name into a hat and pay $1 if you lose. You're participating in the quote-unquote democratic process. And so by doing that, aren't you agreeing to the outcome, right? It's like if you vote for candidate A, but then candidate A loses, you don't then say, oh, no, I'm not going to be part of this. I won't follow any of the laws that candidate B changes, right? Doesn't seem like the right thing to do. Maybe. But here's the thing. Not all instances that seem to count as implicit consent do count as implicit consent. They need to meet certain conditions or criteria in order to be legitimate. In other words, you can have these nice categories of implicit consent, but in addition to being a type of implicit consent, there are these extra sub-rules, if you want to call them, that you have to follow in order for your mode of implicit consent to actually count as a real mode of implicit consent. And so now we have to ask what the conditions are. If you're still not sure what we mean by sub-rules or conditions, it'll make sense to you very shortly. So look at 25 going into 26. The first condition governing legitimate agreements is that valid consent requires a reasonable way of opting out. All parties to any agreement must have the option to reject the agreement without sacrificing anything to which they have a right. Consider a modification of the boardroom example. The chairman says, next week's meeting will be moved to Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Those who object will kindly signal this by cutting off their left arms. The chairman pauses. No arms come off. Good, it's agreed, he declares. This isn't a valid agreement, because the demand that board members give up their left arms as the price of dissenting from the schedule change is unreasonable. Those who seek your agreement to some proposal may not demand that you give up any of your rights as the cost of rejecting their proposal. Okay, so here's what needs to happen in order for consent to actually exist, in order for an agreement or a contract to actually exist. First of all, you need a way of opting out, period. If someone presents you with a choice, but there's actually no choice, they're saying, hey, you're going to do this thing no matter what. You can't consent to that, right? There's like no way of opting out. But beyond that, you need a reasonable way of opting out, right? Because giving you a choice to not agree isn't enough. Because if you give someone a choice, but the price of dissenting from what you want is too high, it doesn't count. And he uses this example of chopping off your arm. It's not just like that losing your arm is significant. It's that you have a right to your arm. Someone can't say to you, oh, the only way to disagree with me, the only way to not be a part of the system I'm creating is if you give up something that you have a right to. You can't do that. Because if they do that to you, what they're doing is assuming that they have more of a right to that thing than you do, which clearly isn't the case, right? So here's the second condition. He says, explicit dissent trumps alleged implicit consent. A valid implicit agreement does not exist if one explicitly states that one does not agree. Consider a modification of the restaurant example. Suppose that after being seated, you tell the waitress, I will not pay for any food that you bring me, but I would like you to give me a veggie wrap anyway. If the waitress then brings you the wrap, you are not obligated to pay for it. Given your statement, she could not plausibly claim that you agreed to pay for the meal. Okay, so implicit consent's a thing, but if you're explicitly dissenting, surely that can't count as implicit consent, right? And so he modifies that restaurant example. It's one thing if you didn't say anything and then they brought you the food and then you ate it and said, oh, I didn't know I had to pay. But if you stayed up front, I'm not going to pay for any of the food that you bring me, but I want you to bring me food. And then if they give you the food, humor is saying you're not obligated to pay for it, right? Because you gave a very clear statement that you were dissenting to their framework, and they could have rejected you, but they didn't. And in not rejecting you, they were agreeing to this condition. Here's a third type. He says, an action can be taken as indicating agreement to some scheme only if one can be assumed to believe that if one did not take that action, the scheme would not be imposed upon one. Suppose that in the board meeting example, the chairman announces, next week's meeting will be moved to Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and I don't care what any of you have to say about it. The schedule change will happen, whether you object to it or not. Now, does anyone want to object? He pauses. No one says anything. Good, it's agreed, he declares. In this case, there is no valid agreement. Though the board members were given a chance to object, they were also given to understand that if they objected, the schedule change would be imposed anyway. They did not wish to waste their breath protesting something about which they had no choice. So this one is hard to phrase nicely. I don't think it's too hard to understand, but it's hard to make a nice, short one sentence about it, which is why his sentence here is longer. So the idea is, let's say you're presented with a choice, right? Someone says, you could do this, or you cannot do that, right? And now imagine the person made you believe that the thing they wanted was still going to happen, even if you said no. Right, so even if you don't consent, I'm still going to impose the thing upon you. If you're ever in a situation like that, then your lack of explicit dissent doesn't count as implicit consent. Why? Because you had no reason to believe that your consent or lack thereof was going to matter anyway, because the person's mind was already made up, right? It's not actually a choice. They're imposing something and giving you this veiled language of choice, even though there wasn't really a choice when you parse past the words. Or even if you look at the words, right? Here are your choices. This one's going to happen. You could say you want the other one to happen, but it doesn't matter. The other one's going to happen regardless. Like, clearly that doesn't count as consent. And you could think of a number of situations in which something like this wouldn't work, right? Now here's the fourth one. He says, contractual obligation is mutual and conditional. A contract normally places both parties under an obligation to each other, and one party's rejection of his contractual obligation releases the other party from her obligation. Suppose you order food in a restaurant. There is an implicit agreement between you and the restaurant's owners. They provide food, and you pay them. If the waitress never brings the food, then you need not pay them. Their failure to live up to their end of the deal releases you from the obligation to live up to yours. Furthermore, if one party simply communicated that they didn't intend to live up to the agreement, then the other party is not obligated to live up to it either. Thus, if after ordering your food, but before receiving it, you inform the waitress that you recognize no obligation to pay the restaurant, then the restaurant may conclude, I don't know why it says convulse, that you have rejected the agreement and they need not bring you any food. Okay, so when you enter into a contract, it's not a one-way street, right? It's a two-way thing. You guys are only conditionally involved in the contract. If one person breaches, then the other one's free, and vice versa. And he uses this restaurant example, right? If you say after ordering, hey, you know what? I'm not actually going to pay, then the restaurant could not give you food. And that would be okay because you implicated that you weren't going to participate in the agreement. So it's not just actually not living up to your end of the deal. It's even like communicating that you're not going to do that, right? Because that counts as a kind of breach, right? Because the other person believes you're going to breach. So to recap, here were the four principles governing valid agreements again. The first idea was that valid consent requires a reasonable way of opting out, right? Not just any way, a reasonable way. Because even in the chop off your arm example, there is a way of opting out. It's just not reasonable. The second principle is that explicit dissent trumps alleged implicit consent. So sometimes you could count to be consenting to something implicitly, but not if you're explicitly saying you don't consent. Third principle, an action can be taken as indicating agreement only and if one can be assumed to believe that if one didn't take that action, the scheme would not be imposed upon one anyway. So this is that weird one. The idea is that your consent only counts if you had reason to believe that saying no would have been respected by the other party and not just imposed upon you. And then the fourth principle, contractual obligation is mutual and conditional, right? An agreement is a two-way thing. So here's the question. We asked earlier if any of the types of implicit consent applied to our current political situation as American citizens. Now the question is much deeper. It's like, we know it seems like there are answers you can give for all four types of implicit consent. Now the question is, okay, but in addition to seeming like modes of implicit consent, are all the principles met? Are all the conditions met that need to be met in order for it to actually count as consent? Well, let's see what Huemer is going to say. Okay, let's look at the first principle. Does the U.S. give us a reasonable way of opting out of their system? Huemer says, let us review some of the reasons one might have for failing to exercise this option. To leave one's country, one must generally secure the permission of some other state to enter its territory, and most states impose restrictions on immigration. In addition, some individuals lack the financial resources to move to the country of their choice. Those who can move may fail to do so due to the attachments to family, friends, and home. Finally, if one moves to another country, one will merely become subject to another government. What should one do if one does not wish to consent to any government? Those seeking to avoid all governmental jurisdiction have three options. They may live in the ocean, move to Antarctica, or commit suicide. That's it. So there is a way of opting out of the United States system, and it's leaving the United States, right? That's always an option. But the problem is it a reasonable way of opting out? And Humor is saying, no, the exit costs are way too high because you need to get permission from another country. You don't have the money to move where you want to move. And hey, you're rooted here. You have all your friends and family in your home. Like, asking you to give up all of that in order for you to reject the system seems like an unreasonable cost. For that reason, the United States does not meet the first condition. Okay, what about the second one? Humor says, in the case of the social contract, a small number of people have explicitly indicated their disagreement. These are the political anarchists, people who hold that there should be no government. Yet every government continues to impose laws and taxes on anarchists. However vociferously you protest against the social contract, the government will not refund your tax money nor exempt you from the laws. Okay, well, what happens if you explicitly dissent from the U.S. system? Is that dissent respected? Do you suddenly get to leave the system? Do you suddenly have to stop paying taxes, and are you allowed to break laws without facing any punishment? No, of course not. So for this reason, Humor thinks that the U.S. does not meet this condition either. What about the third one? Well, on 31, Humor says, almost everyone knows that the state will still impose the same laws and the same taxes on one, regardless of whether one objects to the government, accepts political services, or participates in the political process. Therefore, one's failure to object, one's acceptance of government services, and even one's participation in the political process cannot be taken to imply agreement to the social contract. Okay, so he's saying, in the current situation you find yourself in, he's asking, do you have reason to believe that if you dissented, that the government would respect your choice? And he's saying, no. He's saying, regardless of if you don't explicitly dissent, if you accept services, and even if you vote, none of this actually counts as consent because there wasn't ever any option for you to not consent. It just looks like that. And I think at some point he says something like, well, people think that they consent to paying taxes. Like, oh yeah, I voluntarily pay my taxes. And he says, that's not true. And if you want to know why that's not true, just try to not pay your taxes and see what happens. Because your dissent is not actually going to be respected, right? So it's not real consent. So the U.S. does not meet that condition according to him. All right, what about the fourth one? He says, the appeal... Oh, by the way, back up a little bit. You will have read, I didn't want to put it all on the slide, but you'll read around 33, even before maybe on 32, 31, about this situation where these girls were living in a house, and I think there were like 2 girls upstairs and 1 or 2 girls downstairs, and they heard their roommate screaming and maybe someone break in, and they didn't know what was going on. So they called the cops and said, hey, I think someone broke in my house and harmed my roommate. Can you guys come by? So the cops came by and just kind of like knocked on the door gently. And when no one answered, they just walked away and drove away. Right? They didn't even like investigate further. They didn't check all the doors and windows. They didn't come in. They didn't do any of that stuff. So After a little while, the girls, I believe, still heard noise and they knew the situation wasn't resolved. So they called the cops again, this time saying, hey, something is definitely going on downstairs. Please send someone over. So this time, the cops just never came back. So after a while, the girls heard no more noise and they thought everything was over. They thought the police arrived, though. They came downstairs or out their door, but the cops never actually came. The intruders just weren't making any noise. And what happened is the girls merely alerted their presence to the guys who broke in the house, and the girls wound up being kidnapped and tortured and raped and all sorts of terrible things, all because the police didn't show up, right? Now, the girls sued or attempted to sue the government for failing to provide their end of the agreement, because that's the whole point of the social contract, right? It's like, hey, I'm paying my taxes and I'm following laws. Isn't this only so that you can protect me when I need it? That was their argument, and it went to an appeals court. But Humer says, and this is where the quote comes in on 33, the appeals court cited the fundamental principle that a government and its agents are under no general duty to provide public services such as police protection to any particular individual citizen. The government's duty, the court explained, was only a duty to the public at large, to provide a general deterrent to crime. In other words, there is no individual social contract between you and the government, because if there was, then you would be owed some kind of compensation for government negligence in the case like these girls who were abused because the police didn't show up to the house and do what they were supposed to do. Instead, there is only a loose social contract that applies to the public at large. And this just provides a general crime deterrent, general protection. And so that each individual consents to a non-individual but general social contract. A very interesting principle. But Humer says this shows that contractual obligation is not mutual and conditional when it comes to the government, because the government failed to uphold their end of the bargain in the situation with the girls. And it's not like now they're freed. Now they don't have to pay taxes or follow laws. No, they still have to do all that stuff. They are still bound by the contract, even though the government isn't. Pretty crazy stuff. So here's the conclusion. According to Humer, U.S. citizens don't actually implicitly agree to a social contract because the U.S. government doesn't abide by the 4 principles governing valid agreements. So it seems like there's an implicit agreement, right? You vote, you accept services, you stay in the location and all that good stuff. But those are only ostensibly cases of valid implicit agreement because they don't actually meet any of the 4 principles that he outlined in this chapter. So for Humer, then, anarchism is the morally correct position, which is super, super interesting. If you're interested, check him out further. Now, here are the questions we're left with at the end of the day. Is he right? Is he right to point out that the United States doesn't meet any of the conditions required for valid agreements? Or is he incorrect because those aren't even the conditions? Or maybe those are the conditions, but there's other ones that they do meet that he didn't account for or something like that. But if he is right to state that they don't meet any of these conditions and that anarchism is the correct ethical position, then what should we do? Right? Because that's what normative ethics is all about. How should we act in lieu of this information? And if he's not correct, then why is he incorrect? Right? And I'll leave it there today, guys. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me. Stay safe.